Preservation Piedmont President, Jenny Keller, who would like to say just a few words on their behalf. Jenny is an architectural historian and preservation planner, has dedicated her career to this field, so we're really happy to have her expertise as part of this series as well.
Thank you, Olivia. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see so many familiar faces and new faces. Preservation is about partnerships, and so often it depends on public-private partnerships and sharing information ideas, and that's what we're kicking off tonight. I'm thrilled, really excited that these four groups, the city, the county, the Historical Society, and Preservation Piedmont are doing something together, and something we're going to continue to do over the next several months, sharing information, sharing ideas. We've partnered several times in the past, but we've never done it with these four groups, and I think that's so important in these times so that we can join forces, we can do so much more together than we can apart, and we can really raise awareness of our area's cultural, historic, and natural resources and the blending of those. Like the Historical Society, we are also a 501c3 membership organization, and I'll have something for you to sign up with your email addresses when we go into the refreshment room at the end of the program, and I hope you will take a look at us on our website and be interested in some of the things that we do as well. We were founded about 40 years ago, almost 40 years ago, and we serve the city, Albemarle County, and the nearby and adjacent counties. We are primarily raising awareness and advocacy organization, and two of the projects we're working on right now are saving the historic Wharton Baker House on Wortland Street in the city, near the corner. It has been proposed for demolition. The city's BAR denied that application, but it's been appealed to City Council. So if you're inclined to advocate preservation of the home of the university's long-term and second librarian appointed by Jefferson in the last year of his life, please join us in that effort. The other thing that we're very actively involved in is the preservation of the Woolen Mills Historic Chapel. That's a physical project that we've been working on for a bit now and in process for that. So those some things about us. I'm just thrilled that we're doing this tonight and that we're going to be so grounded in historical information, documentation. That is really what we're about, is making decisions based on good information and good preservation theory and practice. So, thank you.
So now we'll really get started, I promise. I'm delighted to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. J. Jacob Calhoun. Dr. Calhoun received his PhD from the University of Virginia in 2024, and for the past year, he's been a postdoctoral researcher at both the Now Center for Civil War History and with us at the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society. This fall, he will begin a new position as the Byron K. Trippett Assistant Professor of History and the David A. Moore Chair of American History at Wabash College in Indiana. We'll be sad to see Jake leave us on Monday. More sad to see his dog Gumbo leave us on Monday, who hangs out with us at the Historical Society. But we have been so lucky to have Dr. Calhoun work on this project for ACHS for about 14 months now. And his talk is bringing the first phase of that to completion. So the work you will see today is that of Dr. Calhoun, of other staff, of our amazing summer interns, all over that period of 14 months. We've been absolutely blown away by their work. I hope you will be as well. This phase of the project, while it is just that, a phase, is going to be available on the ACHS website for public use. But we hope that it might unlock opportunities to not only continue our research at Browns Cove, but also to inspire similar work in other parts of our county. So without further ado, I will turn it over. Please help me welcome Dr. J. Jacob Calhoun.
Okay, hi everyone. First, let me just say it is incredibly humbling to see so many people turn out to hear about the history of Browns Cove. I'll be completely honest, I didn't know what Browns Cove was just over a year ago when I started this project. But after delving into the history, I have found it absolutely fascinating. And I really hope that with this presentation, we can provide you with kind of some basic idea of like what this project is, what we've been trying to do, hopefully what we've done. But also provide you with some overarching kind of ideas and history of Browns Cove in case this is the first time you're hearing about Browns Cove. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into things. First and foremost, though, I do want to thank our interns who worked on this project with me, Joseph Talley, Katie Aney, Ruth Kramer, and Tremont Edmondson. Without y'all, we would not have been able to actually produce this project and get it to where it is. So it's a collaborative effort from the ground up. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into things. So where is Browns Cove is probably the first question that many of you are probably asking. Or if you're from Browns Cove, that may be something you're very familiar with. But for those of you who aren't, Browns Cove is a region in western Albemarle County around the Doyles River in the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, just north of Crozet. So it is relatively geographically isolated to a certain extent, at least from the west. And as a result, it has a unique kind of topography to the rest of Albemarle County and the rest of Virginia in a lot of ways. It is pretty mountainous. For those of you who have kind of driven through or down Browns Gap Turnpike, you have probably seen how windy that road can be, how gorgeous it is. But that topography informed a lot of the history that we're going to be talking about today. So the dominating feature of Browns Cove is, of course, Browns Gap, a small kind of divot passageway through the mountain that allows folks to basically pass through the mountain. It's a historic trail that is still now able to be traversed today through Browns Gap Turnpike. But in terms of where the term Browns Cove comes from, it is named after really one of the first kind of like colonists and patriarchs to establish himself and his family in the area, and that was Benjamin Brown Sr. So Benjamin Brown Sr. Acquired the land, or the first tract of land that would become Browns Cove in 1743, just a year before the founding of Albemarle County. And he actually moved there in around 1745, along with 5 children and his wife, Sarah Thompson Brown. And once there, they had 5 more sons, all of whom had B names, which made researching very difficult because you had to, when you saw the name Bezaleel Brown, you had to figure out if it was Bezaleel Brown Sr., Bezaleel G. Brown, Bezaleel G. Brown Sr., Bezaleel G. Brown Jr. Genealogical efforts made that a little bit, I made that genealogical efforts a little difficult. One side note, there was one name that really stuck in my craw for a while, and that was William Brown. So William, why is the one W name in here? And then I went, oh, Bill Brown, right. The only, I believe, exception is Lucretia Brown, and I don't know why they stuck with Lucretia, but everybody else has B names. But anyway, so Browns Cove, let me just, in terms of this project, I mean, one of the things that I think we had to kind of answer when we first started this project was like, why are we focusing on Browns Cove? What is significant about the region? Really just why Browns Cove? There's a lot of different areas that comprise Albemarle County. What's special about this area? Why does it merit this kind of focused study? And there's a number of different reasons for that. First and foremost is just the sheer scale of it. Browns Cove, at its height, we're talking about all the land that was owned by the Brown family and their descendants. We're looking at probably approaching 10% of all of Albemarle County, so it's a pretty substantial area of the county. Additionally, we know that this area has like a pretty lasting legacy. I mean, we're talking about the mid-18th century here. This is obviously before the Revolution. This is before the United States, and yet we're going to see how the descendants actually last up until the 20th century. Not just last, they're in Browns Cove and living in Browns Cove. And that goes for the Brown family as well as descendants of the enslaved and the enslaved in Browns Cove. We have a lot of stability in the region. And so that's what the 3 themes that we're trying to focus on with this project, and it hopefully come through in this digital project. That's scope, stability, and dynamism. So scope, first and foremost, we're talking about, again, the scale of Browns Cove, a pretty substantial holding or collective holdings in the area. But we're also talking about scope in terms of time. Again, we're seeing an area develop and change over the course of 2 centuries, essentially. And we're able to study it kind of with a pretty focused eye because, again, things are kind of staying within the hands of the Browns throughout this period. And the people who are living in Browns Cove, there's not a lot of, let's say, turnover of people coming in and exiting. So the scope of it also lends itself to the stability. And stability was another reason we were focused on it. I mean, if you think about other kind of plantations or farms or areas in Albemarle County, we see that there's a lot of changing of hands. I mean, Monticello, you know, after Jefferson's death, people and the property are being auctioned off. And so we see that there's this dispersion that happens, and so there's a lot of changing of hands. That doesn't really happen in the same way in Browns Cove. So that stability makes it kind of unique in Albemarle County and unique in Virginia. Additionally, we want to focus on the dynamism. By dynamism, what I mean is the rapid changes that happen all around Browns Cove, but also the changes that are happening within Browns Cove. There's some unique elements to this story that kind of lend, or unique elements that kind of stem from the way in which the Brown family kind of operated in Browns Cove, the way in which descendants of, the way in which non-Browns in the Cove operated, people who were enslaved by the Browns, how they kind of formed communities and survived. And so what we're trying to do here in this project is kind of balance the stability, the dynamism, and the scope all within this kind of digital project. It's a tall order. Hopefully we did okay. In terms of the aim of it, I want to briefly talk about the aim of this history project and this digital project generally. It's really to provide context for folks who, like me starting out this project, had no idea about Browns Cove, didn't know of its great significance to Albemarle County, to Virginia, and also to show kind of the uniqueness of it. This story is not one I had heard of before. In fact, you know, we kind of get let's say a brief summation of Virginia history. We were studying early America. You know, Virginia history is like this and X, Y, Z. But we see that Browns Cove kind of defies a lot of that. It's very much a different story in a lot of ways, and that different story is important. So the goal here is not only to give people that history, but also to make it kind of publicly accessible and digitally accessible. And that kind of brings us to the next question: why a digital map? When I'm using map here, I'm using kind of capaciously. I mean, a lot of things. I mean, an actual digital map, like this one that I'll show you in a bit, that actually has, you know, data loaded up onto it that you can kind of explore at your own pace. But I'm also talking about StoryMaps. This is a project is being hosted on what's called ArcGIS online. This is essentially a digital mapping tool that allows you to take these maps and also turn them into narratives to provide people with context. And so actually the bulk of this project is a collection of what are called story maps, basically almost self-guided PowerPoints that are interactive to a certain degree that allow you to explore this history at your own pace. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I will encourage you to do so at your own leisure at some point. So there are 3 main kind of components to this project. One is the interactive map, which again is going to be, I'll show you this at the end of the presentation, kind of how it operates and the data that's loaded up onto it. But there's also the story maps. This is a collection that we had ended up with 9 story maps related to various different themes and properties in Browns Cove, allowing you to explore this history. And the third component is actually a timeline, a chronological timeline that also has a degree of interactivity with it that allows you to basically contextualize the history that you're learning about. Figure out what was going on not just in Browns Cove, but in the world that surrounded it. Because we see that, you know, Browns Cove was, despite its kind of isolated location geographically, was very much, you know, in touch with the rest of the world. It was interconnected via markets, via people, and so we're going to talk a bit about that as well, or we showcase that in the project through the timeline. So with that, I'm going to actually now jump into the last piece here, the timeline, to kind of provide you all with an overview of the history of Browns Cove, and hopefully in doing so kind of convey why I think it's so fascinating and what makes it unique. So let's see if we can do this. This is not my laptop, so we're going to patience if that's all right. Yes, there we go. Okay. So this is the home page for our project, Contours of Community, Digitally Mapping Browns Cove. And the first thing that it brings you to is the timeline, Browns Cove, the timeline. Also, you're going to see a number of different photographs through here. There are really excellent black and white photographs of Browns Cove. These were taken recently by Roland Hartley, whom we're very much indebted to because I am not a photographer, and so he is very much able to kind of bring to life a lot of this narrative. So we've divvied up the history of Browns Cove in kind of 5 eras: the creation of Browns Cove, its expansion, its operations during the antebellum economy, and then the kind of reconstruction of Browns Cove at the time of the Civil War, and kind of what we're calling the deconstruction of Browns Cove, when kind of a lot of these properties are finally falling out of the hands of the Brown family descendants, and folks are actually kind of leaving the area. And for the first time in its history, we see a lot of turnover. We see a lot of people leaving the Cove, and why that happens. So I was a big advocate of starting pretty early. But we need to talk about the geological formations to understand kind of why this unique history emerged. I mean, the terrain and the topography of this area is indeed unique. As, if you drive down Browns Gap Turnpike, it's kind of self-evident that it's kind of striking. But what's fascinating about it is that it informs kind of how humans inhabited and operated in the region. So we have basically the Appalachian Mountains form. We have the first people arrive in what will become Browns Cove around 16,000 BCE. That's a 4 Common Era. And during this time, we see that more and more folks are kind of establishing societies, moving in and out. But eventually we get to what's called the early woodland period around 1200 BC. And that is when we see folks like the Monacan peoples and other Siouan-speaking peoples can inhabit the area. And they remain there up through probably the 18th century, for sure the 17th century. But we say 18th because in the earliest recorded kind of records of Browns Cove, we find that there are people citing interactions with quote-unquote Indians who were living in the area. It could be that they were Iroquois, but it's very likely that they were also Monacan or descendants of Monacan peoples. So we also kind of chart colonization in the early 17th century, beginning with the arrival of British colonists, the formation of the Powhatan Confederacy, kind of giving folks like an overview of early Virginia history. Of course, the arrival of the first enslaved Africans to the shores of Virginia in 1619, and over time, we eventually get to, let's say, the critical point, which is 1739, actually, in which King George provides land grants, or issues large land grants in Virginia. And he issues one in the area that will become Browns Cove to David Mills, not the name you were thinking of. David Mills is the first to actually get a land grant. He doesn't seem to develop it, though. These land grants are conditional, which means that if you get one, you're expected to develop the land, kind of turn it into farmland, into homestead, to improve it, quote unquote. And so eventually David Mills actually sells it and grants it to eventually Benjamin Brown Sr. Benjamin Brown Sr. is from Hanover County. He acquires the lands, about 2,850 acres from David Mills. I'll go ahead and do the one little kind of thing that this work. This should take you to the map viewer here that will show you the exact land grant that is here. So you can see when it was issued and the exact kind of property lines of where it used to be. So you can see it's right north of Doylesville, up to kind of what is now headquarters along the Doyles River. And this essentially establishes, Browns Cove. So originally it's purchased in 1743, but Benjamin Brown Sr. doesn't move there with his family until around 1745. He actually sends before him enslaved laborers to actually build Walnut Level, which is where he ends up living. So the first person actually to really inhabit and begin developing that land is not Benjamin Brown Sr. It is enslaved laborers. And so we see that, this is kind of immediately at the beginning of Browns Cove, there's inequitability that's present in this story. And in this project, we try to showcase that. We don't try to shy away from it. We're trying to tell not just the story of the Brown family, but of the people who live in Browns Cove, hopefully successfully, or at least the early American period of that history. So Benjamin Brown Sr. dies in the midst of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in 1762, and at which point his property is divvied up amongst his heirs. And what's odd here is that normally you would expect Virginia planters in the 18th century to divvy up their property not very much. They might give a few plots of land to, a couple of individual sons, but generally most of their holdings go to their oldest son. That is normally how it happens. Second or third sons would normally strike out westward, try to, find some way to kind of establish their own property, plantation, etc. But that's not what an Brown Sr. does. Instead, he divvies up a lot of his holdings to various members or various sons, and as a result, you have kind of the formation of Brown's Cove as different Browns begin to operate what we would call like large farms or small plantations, essentially in terms of size. So if you look at all of Brown's Cove together, what you're looking at is a very large kind of like plantation that rivaled Monticello, right, in terms of size. But individually, when we get to the late 18th century, early 19th century, these are all held by individual Browns who are cooperating with one another, we find, throughout the late 18th century and early 19th century, which kind of lends itself to, I didn't do that, which kind of lends itself to a kind of resiliency that we find. For instance, there are lumber mills on one property, there's blacksmithing shops on another property, and as a result, this allows this community to kind of be self-sustained in a lot of ways, and indeed pretty resilient. With the arrival of the Revolutionary War, we see that a number of Browns enlist to fight in the Continental Army. War kind of shapes Brown's Cove in a lot of ways, or at least kind of the legacy of it. There are two Browns who actually died in the Revolutionary War, William Brown and Tarleton Brown, while other members of the Brown family distinguish themselves, such as Bezaleel Brown, who's captain in the Virginia State Militia. He goes on to become essentially a close confidant of Thomas Jefferson. There's also famous stories that Burnis Brown stored away the Virginia State archives during the war in order to essentially prevent them from being seized by the British. So again, a fascinating kind of unique story that's present. But what's to me the most compelling is that, generally speaking, in the late 18th century, what we see in Virginia taking place is a lot of change, a kind of a shift that happens. Specifically after this Revolutionary War, there's a heavy depression that a lot of times ends a lot of these plantations. Monticello goes under, James Monroe goes under, and it's not just the failing of these plantations, it's the effects it has, not first and foremost on perhaps the families of those individuals, but they're the people who are being enslaved. For instance, at Monticello, famously enslaved people are auctioned off as a result of the plantation basically going under. They were sent all over, same thing with James Monroe's plantation. That doesn't happen in Brown's Cove. These smaller plots of land, these smaller farms and plantations actually seem to survive this economic upheaval. And there's a number of reasons for that. And it's a thread we try to follow in this project, namely that they didn't really fully commit themselves to kind of large-scale tobacco production that you would find on other plantations at the time. For instance, there seemed to be a lot of animal husbandry that grew progressively more common over the course of the 19th century. A lot of kind of subsistence farming. They were growing foodstuffs a lot of times in addition to tobacco. So there was tobacco being grown in this area, but it was in Brown's Cove, but it was not kind of the be-all, end-all the way it was with most plantations in the 18th century in Virginia. And as a result, when the tobacco economy began to basically collapse by the early 19th century, and the cotton economy began to take off in the Deep South, whereas a lot of kind of economic enterprises and plantations in Virginia went under, the Brown's Cove survived. And this had dual effects. First and foremost, the Browns stayed generally in control of their leasehold properties. Their descendants remained kind of operating their properties, but also enslaved people who would find themselves in a precarious position of, potentially being risked, or in the risk of being shipped southward to Mississippi, Alabama, in the case of one of these plantations going under, found themselves actually being able to survive and retain a bit of kind of consistency, or be able to stay in Brown's Cove, essentially what I'm trying to say. And we see that is the case over the course of the 19th century, that enslaved people seem to have not experienced a good deal of being bought and brought into Brown's Cove or being sold out of Brown's Cove. Now, I want to be very clear. This does not mean that slavery in Brown's Cove was any less horrifying or difficult than it was anywhere else in Virginia. Slavery is always slavery. But what's interesting is that there's this kind of communal network that forms in the area because of the fact that you have people who are not, who are staying in the area that aren't being oftentimes sold elsewhere. This does not mean that slave sales did not happen. I'm sure they did. But we just don't see that kind of large-scale diaspora that we see with a lot of these other plantations, and that's a unique story. So over the course of the 19th century, there's agricultural and political decline in Virginia. It basically goes through what we call a demographic crisis, as essentially it just doesn't have enough industry to really provide for its population that is now beginning to leave Virginia to go elsewhere. The population is continuing to dwindle during this point, and it also results in widespread sales of enslaved people, which again doesn't happen at Brown's Cove. The reason for that's a few, but first and foremost, the reason that there's so many slave sales happening is because Virginia's #1 commodity during the 19th century are enslaved people. It's their #1 export, pretty much. And yet, we don't see a lot of turnover present in places like Mount Fair, Walnut Level, these kind of plantations in Brown's Cove. And the reason for that is a couple of things. First and foremost, again, the nature of the land in Brown's Cove made tobacco harvesting not a good idea to go all in on. But additionally, we also see that individual decisions by the Browns were focused more on what was called the renting of enslaved people. We have a lot of records of William T. Brown and others renting enslaved people. This is meaning they would basically provide one of their neighbors' quote-unquote use of enslaved person. It's pretty horrific, but they would basically work and then they would get the wages. That was a very common tactic for the Browns in order to basically prevent having to sell enslaved people. Likely, this is probably not done out of the goodness of their hearts, but likely because enslaved people were such a commodity. But because of that, the kind of additional effect of that is that, again, enslaved communities seem to have a bit more stability in Brown's Cove than elsewhere, at least what we find in the records. So, as the 19th century progresses, eventually we get to a number of panics, a number of economic upheavals. These continue to kind of rock the United States, specifically the Virginia economy, and yet we see that Brown's Cove remains relatively resilient. It stays within the hands of the Browns' descendants up until the Civil War. And in the Civil War, also one other thing I do want to mention, politically the Browns are actually a fascinating group because most Virginia planters, especially as we get to the 1840s and 50s, are Democrats, as in they are very much proponents of westward expansion. They want to go westward. They're kind of Jacksonian Democrats is what it would be called. That's not the case with the Browns. Almost all of the Browns are part of the Whig Party, which if you're a 19th century history buff, basically this is a party focused on internal developments, improvements, which is very significant because one of the Browns, Brightberry Brown, created the famous Browns Gap Turnpike, essentially a toll road directly through Blue Ridge Mountains. I'll just go back here to the actual turnpike. And this is actually another form of industry. This is very much part of the Whig Party platform, internal developments, growth, kind of building up the territory that the United States has already seized versus kind of expanding further and further westward. And so we see that this kind of aligns with a lot of the kind of philosophy of the Browns. I believe there's only one Democrat Browns, and I think that's Bernard Brown, who's a preacher. For some reason, he wanted to go against the grain for his family, but the rest of them seem to have been Whigs, which is fascinating. So we get to the Civil War, and the Civil War, of course, sees many of the Brown family enlist for the Confederacy. There are the most famous kind of example we found was Bezalel G. Garland Brown. He is the son of William T. Brown, who owned Mount Fair. Bezalel G. Brown served in Robert E. Lee's Army Corps of Virginia. He basically went all over the entirety of the South, fighting with Army Corps of Virginia. Finished his kind of tour returning to Mount Fair, having survived basically all these famous encounters, including Gettysburg. He survives, returns, and dies, I believe, 2 weeks later at Mount Fair. It's a fascinating story. But while the Browns are kind of finding that a lot of their experiencing tragedy and hardship, this is really, for most people living in Browns Cove, a moment of celebration, because most people in Browns Cove who are actually populating the area are being emancipated in this moment. They're actually finding, they're fleeing to Union lines, and they're trying to find a way to kind of establish a new birth of freedom within the heart of Virginia, and that's what they do. It is difficult and hard fought. There is consistent kind of violence and economic exploitation as free people try to advocate for themselves as freedmen begin to go to the voting booth in making an effort to kind of enter into the sphere of high politics. But as a result, we do see that there are gains made. A lot of times what we find I'm a scholar of Reconstruction, first and foremost, and so what a lot of times we find in Reconstruction is the second emancipation happens, what enslaved people often do, formerly enslaved people often do, is try to find their family, because families were broken up consistently. Marriage vows, famously in the Deep South for enslaved people, were till death or distance do you part. And so formerly enslaved people would go try to find their family members, their wives, husbands, children, who were sold off during slavery. And what we find is that while that could have very well happened at Browns Cove, we don't know that it didn't. We do know that because of the resiliency of other communities' presence amongst the enslaved, we do get the sense that most likely a lot of them already had retained, close connections with their family, and so it seems as though many of them still stayed in the area, at least in the immediate aftermath of the 19th century. That changes in the 20th century, but we'll talk about that later. In 1872, we also see I believe it's right here. In 1863, we see the first time one of the properties, the main four properties comprising Browns Cove, leave Brown family ownership at Walnut level. 1872 sees headquarters leave Brown's family ownership. And then we see a number of kind of economic depressions, collapses, and this slowly over time results in kind of let's say, substantial changes in Browns Cove. We see that this is for the first time around the time where we have, let's say, not wealthy white farmers or white laborers moved into Browns Cove for what we can find. This does not mean that there weren't other free white people or other white people in Virginia or in Browns Cove prior to the Civil War, but we definitely see that the influx of white, let's say, laborers into Browns Cove kind of happens after the Civil War. Prior to that, like most kind of areas in Central Virginia, it was populated largely by white planters and enslaved people. But that begins to change in the late 19th century. Eventually, we get to this phase, deconstructing Browns Cove, is what we're calling it. This is essentially when things begin to change. First and foremost, there's a period of the Great Migration in which all of a sudden Black Americans have new opportunities in the north, in cities, places like Pennsylvania, where they can actually leave, and not only leave, but find better working conditions. They can be free from kind of terrorist violence in the Deep South. And actually establish themselves with kind of a new hope for freedom. That happens at Browns Cove, at least from what the kind of secondary research we've been able to find. And eventually we have Brightberry and Mount Fair leave the kind of core family ownership. And that kind of gives you an overview of the large history of Browns Cove. I know I went through literally 2 centuries of history there, but hopefully that gives you a sense of kind of the unique nature of this story. And again, this is just one component of the digital project. This is purpose of this timeline is to allow people to kind of go through and learn about what's going on in the world, how does that affect Browns Cove, etc. So also as you go through a lot of this, you can find that we've hyperlinked a lot of this information for further reading. So for instance, if you want to learn more about Wesley G. Brown, it can sometimes take us to the work we've already done. For instance, let me go down to our index here. This is one of the longer story maps, which I'll get to in a bit, but if we get to, for instance, Wesley Brown, this is where Wesley G. Brown served in the Confederate Army. Again, going from various different prison camps as he was captured around Gettysburg. And so you can actually kind of explore this at your own leisure, but we try to tie that into this timeline to allow you to kind of go back and forth, learning about this history and then going back to the timeline, kind of understand what's going on in American history at that time. So with that, I'd like to talk about how the story maps. This is kind of bread and butter of the project for the most part. So if you go to the main page, you'll see that there's Browns Cove timeline, but you also have a number of different what are called story maps, these self-guided PowerPoint tours where you can learn about some of this history. So if we could do this forever, we would have 20,000 of these story maps. There's so much to say about Browns Cove. But we tried to limit it first and foremost to the 4 kind of main properties that established kind of Browns Cove proper. Mount Fair, Walnut Level, Brightberry, and headquarters. These also have all historic kind of structures on them. So you can go through, learn about this history, see the stories that have been kind of told about it, and then see where they're actually, where the land was held. And then you can kind of just right here, go to the side, learn about Walnut Level. And then of course, Brightberry. And finally, headquarters. Now, we have these properties kind of, that was our first kind of starting point. But then I want to do some thematic understandings, things that I found kind of important or significant, or just that I thought very inclusion in this project. The most important one, I think, one that's kind of a core feature of the history of Browns Cove is enslavement. Enslavement at Browns Cove is incredibly significant. The people who built Browns Cove were first and foremost not the Browns, but the people who were enslaved by the Browns. They were the ones who kind of participated in the actual labor of constructing these homes, of actually like tilling the land, working the land. And it's there, as best we can, try to center them in this story. We've done our best to kind of find some genealogical data that will hopefully be useful. I know many of you probably do your own histories into Browns Cove or are part of your own projects that are studying Browns Cove, and hopefully this will be an additional resource. We don't want to step on any toes with this project at all, but we do want to provide you with additional resources that will allow you to kind of explore or follow new threads. So in enslavement at Browns Cove, there are two major enslaved cemeteries that we want to talk about at Browns Cove. We talk about them here, as well as try to record the kind of way in which the community seemed to be pretty stable in Browns Cove, and what that means. Again, these enslaved cemeteries are still present today, and we have photographs of them, largely thanks again to Roland Hartley, as well as a few other places. But we've also provided a bit of genealogical data where we could. So if you go to, for instance, when we go to the history of Mount Fair, StoryMap, in here we have an index of various names of people who were born enslaved on the Virginia Slave Birth Index, the Brown Property Assessment. These are the names of individuals who were enslaved by the Browns, and specifically it allows us to kind of piece together some of this history and kind of draw connecting threads. And again, these are all kind of will be explored at your leisure. Again, we see that over the course of the 19th century, hundreds of people were actually enslaved in Browns Cove. Each individual property didn't really seem to extend beyond around, let's say 20 to 50 enslaved people at the height during the 1840s and 50s. But over the course of the 19th century, hundreds of people lived their lives enslaved in Browns Cove, and many of them still lie there today in the enslaved cemeteries. So, again, that was one of the important ones. Another one we want to talk about was war in Browns Cove. Again, many of the Brown families served during the Revolutionary War. Also, the Civil War itself sparked one of the most substantial changes in Browns Cove, in which hundreds of enslaved people achieved their freedom and began to kind of reckon with what that new freedom meant. And also just kind of talking about the extent to which war kind of shaped Browns Cove and it shaped its economy. This is really kind of what we're trying to do with this particular story map. Another one that I want to mention was, I was an advocate for this one. We didn't have as much as I would like to, if I'm being honest, but I wanted to talk about horses in Browns Cove because they feature actually pretty prominently. We know that animal husbandry was very much a focus of the Brown families, mainly because, again, they're not solely relying on tobacco production to achieve their wealth. But we also know that folks like Captain Bezaleel Brown Bradbury Brown, was renowned for his basically eye for horses. We found instances in newspapers of Bradbury Brown basically saying, I've seen this particular foal, I can vouch that they are of good stock, etc. And so as a result, horses are actually a pretty major feature of kind of Browns Cove history. They're kind of always in the background. So I want to talk about that. And then of course, not always positively, William T. Brown of Mount Fair lives through the Civil War, and at the age of 77, dies in 1876 from falling from a horse. So anyway, we wanted to include this kind of piece of information, this kind of thread that just kept popping up. We also want to talk about folks who are not just the male Browns who inherited kind of these estates, but also the women of Browns Cove, who played a major feature in kind of shaping the history and trajectory of this region. So in the 19th century, women legally are not allowed to own property in their own right under something called coverture. It's expected that all property would be held for them by their nearest male relative, a husband, a father, sometimes brother, if there was a husband or father in the picture. But what we find is that despite that law, women in Browns Cove did hold property pretty consistently. They were listed as holding various kind of as holding land, as well as actually, importantly, holding property in the forms of human beings. There were actually many women who were enslaved here, listed as enslavers in Browns Cove. In fact, I believe there were around 50 one of the interns here, around 50 women who were listed as enslaving someone in Browns Cove, or in Albemarle County. Over 100, oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, so again, with a pretty substantial number of women were engaged in kind of the production in Browns Cove as well as kind of the exploitation in Browns Cove. They're major players. They were very much not in the background, but kind of right in the foreground of what was taking place. Again, after William Brown dies after falling off the horse in 1876 and not there, Mary Ann Jarman Brown continued to live there for actually over a decade, kind of stewarding the property until eventually she passed in 1888. So again, we see that women are a major feature in this story. We've tried to bring that through with this kind of story map, but again, also talking about the differing experience of women in Browns Cove. Not just the women of the Brown family, but also enslaved women who faced immense trials in trying to actually survive and manage, not only being a woman in the 19th century, but an enslaved woman in the 19th century. We were able to actually follow some women from, enslavement to post-emancipation period, like Elizabeth Brown, who appears in 1850, and then we can see that we involve some of them after the 19th century, or excuse me, after the antebellum period into the post-emancipation period. And then finally, we also want to talk briefly about Browns Cove into the 20th century. This is where, we mentioned this in the phase, I think there's so much more that could be done to talk about this. The more recent history is something that, we'd love to kind of delve more into, but for now I want to talk about kind of the ways in which the Brown family properties finally actually kind of fall out of the hands of the Browns finally, and that's kind of where we kind of bookend our project for the most part, in this kind of early 20th century period. And we talk about kind of what happens to them, what's going on with them now, to provide people who don't know anything about these properties, like I didn't, again, when I first started, kind of an overview of where, what they're being used for now, what this land is currently being used for, and it's, again, we're kind of using this to bookend this whole story so that you kind of go through your own leisure and figure out all this history and then understand what's going on with these properties today. Okay. Now, I guess I'm saying the best for last. This is all about digitally mapping Browns Cove. Let's go to the digital map. Okay, there we go. So first and foremost, these are a number of key sites in Browns Cove. Again, credit to Roland Hartley for the photographs of these various sites, but you can actually go through and you can click, and you can find photographs, for instance, Browns Gap, along with kind of a list of the date of when these places were formed. So Browns Gap Turnpike, which was established in 1805. You can see a photo of it here, and you can kind of get a sense and get your bearings as you kind of maneuver your way through Browns Cove. So again, you can get views from key sites like Cedar Mountain. You can also see, this is a very cool thing, this is a chestnut tree, which I know sounds kind of innocuous, but these were once prevalent throughout the 19th century. They were used as boundary markers sometimes. But in the early 1900s, there's a blight that removed a lot of the chestnut trees in the area, so you actually can't find that many. And we'll see if I can find one of my favorite sites here. I believe it is right here. Well, excuse me. I don't think I found it, but if you can find, there's one site that is actually one of the historic boundary markers in Browns Cove for where the original kind of original boundary markers, the property markers, were various trees, and some of those trees are actually still standing. And I'm in the midst of all these points, and I'm so sorry, I'm forgetting which one it was. But again, you can see, so you can kind of go through, see photographs of the Doyle's River, go to the various sites like the Spring House on Mount Bear property, which is probably one of the oldest structures still standing, dated to probably around 1799. So that's one element that you can do with, you can use this digital map for. But another thing I find fascinating is if you go to the layers, we've actually keyed all the layers, thanks to the work from Christy Kendall, who helped us kind of figure out the property lines and the chain of title for a lot of these properties beginning in 1740. You can actually go over and click 1740, and you can see who owned this particular property. William Burris, grantor King George II, on March 1740. We did this decade by decade, so it wouldn't be overwhelming. And if you want to, you can overlay that with, well, okay, what does it look like in 1930? with these various properties. You can click on that, get information about when it was sold, who it was sold by, and so you can do this for virtually every decade up until 1950, which I think is pretty interesting. I do want to say this is not fully complete. As you see that there are gaps in the property lines here. We have about 60% of Browns Cove mapped in terms of property lines. But there is more that could be done. But still, there's a lot here that I think you'll find fascinating. You can see again, like, okay, who owns this, or what sale took place here, who owns this property in 1860? You can go see, okay, grantee, Bezalel Brown Jr., grantor, the will of Bezalel Brown Sr. Okay, so you see this property being granted to Bezalel Brown around 1860. So again, I encourage you to kind of take your time, explore these properties, figure out, who was owning various land that you were kind of thinking of maybe driving by if you ever drive out to Browns Cove. And again, hopefully this will be a useful resource for folks if they do participate in genealogical efforts or just want to learn more about, the Albemarle County. I do want to briefly mention that, got my notes here. So all these together kind of form what I hope is kind of a more pretty comprehensive view kind of what Browns Cove is during early America. There's a lot more to be said. Encapsulating any history into a digital project over the course of a year is a challenge. But I'm very proud of what we've been able to accomplish, and hopefully you all find it useful. And I would love to hear any questions you have. And thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, we have a microphone. I will do my best to answer.
Thanks, Jake. It's a great presentation. My question is a 20th century question. Clearly, Browns Cove abuts Shenandoah National Park, and obviously the displacement of so many families to create the park in the 1930s. Did you see any overlap in the history? Did Browns Cove lose any land for the creation of Shenandoah National Park?
That's a great question. I believe they did lose land at one point during the 20th century. We actually had a conversation a while back with a couple of folks on this topic. Again, the 20th century is kind of I don't want to say a blind spot. We try to kind of bring forward that history, but I think a lot of what could be done next is oral histories. The folks who kind of know that history or kind of remember people talking about people being displaced. And that is a core feature that could be in kind of a next step for this project, is understanding that kind of 20th century history. Again, how people got displaced. A lot of those communities, were relatively, I would say relatively recently, from the late 19th century, who've been there for, decades, are all of a sudden going to be pushed out. And so that's another step for the project, absolutely.
I had heard at one point, and this was a long time ago, I used to live out there from 1970 to 1990. I knew a fellow who was a historian, his last name was Paulette. He was a grad student at the University of the time up there. In any case, I believe he was the one that mentioned that he'd come across the name Trinidad as being one of the very earliest houses in Browns Cove, and I wondered if you'd run across that.
Yes, we did. So Trinidad, as far as I'm aware, we came across that property name a few times, especially in the early period. As what I understand it to be, and I'm actually, if people have more insight on this, be happy to hear from you. What we understood to be is analogous with Walnut Level, is kind of the area that they're talking about. They're talking about Trinidad. It doesn't seem to be used as we get later in the 19th century, at least it's a common name. But early on, I believe in Benjamin Brown Sr.'s will, he uses the term Trinidad. But what we're kind of referring to generally when we talk about Walnut Level is I believe, the same property. Yeah, great question.
I also wonder if you ever ran across information that Browns Gap Turnpike had been moved in the 20th century, a small part, but nonetheless.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I don't know about Browns Gap Turnpike being moved in the 20th century. I know that the exact route that it was has changed a bit over the course of the 20th century. So that may be what you're referencing there. And I think that does happen. Generally speaking, though, the Browns Gap Turnpike is more or less what it was, as I understand, in the early 19th century when it was first formed. The turnpike has a lot of significance. Not first and foremost was it was a toll road, and it gave Bradbury Brown a lot of wealth. I believe his house was actually called the Toll House for a while. So again, it was another means of income, but it was also the way it passed through the mountains, which became very significant in the Civil War. One of the famous stories is that Stonewall Jackson allegedly, marched his Federal Army kind of through Browns Gap Turnpike. So its development is very significant. But in terms of change in the 20th century, that's another avenue that we can kind of delve into to see where there kind of deviations or breaks in terms of the actual historic trail. We had also a hand up over here.
Yes, I wanted to know how many acres were in the original King's grant, and then was that expanded or contracted in decades after that?
Great question. So I believe originally it was around 2,850 acres was originally what he was granted, and it began to continually expand. Not only because Benjamin Brown was buying more land, but also his sons, as they kind of got a piece of the property, began to purchase more and more and more, which is why I said at one point, we're talking about the most, if you factor in all the land that one of the Brown sons owned and calculate that all together, and you're looking at a huge portion of Albemarle County. They did not always hold on to that land, but they did expand pretty substantially. We can see that too, as a lot of them gained some land around Pasture Fence Mountain. And so I think William T. Brown, for instance, when he inherits Mount Fair, purchases land across the Doyles River to kind of expand those holdings. So they continue to grow until really around, I think, the mid-19th century when things are economically, things are becoming very difficult. Then, of course, during the Civil War, the Browns results in kind of immediately, and then in 1872, with headquarters, kind of the dissolution of a couple of those properties. Great question.
Is all of this available online to the public now?
It is, yes.
And how do you access it?
So I believe, Olivia, you go to the Albemarle Charlottesville Historical Society homepage, and it should be linked right there, I believe.
And if you notice something that isn't quite right,
Great question. Send it to Olivia, and she will forward it on to me if it's in the next 2 days. And then after that, whoever is a historian in the Historical Society after that. But yes, if you do notice something that you have not even, well, feel free to send in corrections, but also if you notice something you have a connection to that you want to talk about, you want to kind of bring more history and shed more light on, please do not hesitate to email us and reach out. That would be, I think, something that would be very worthwhile.
Is it, okay. Heard you refer to Walnut Level, and
What if you came across today with anthems?
and on Walnut Level.
I saw it up there.
Yeah, I think so. We'd have to bring on the interns we were working with up here to see which one of the working options on the level, but I think that name is familiar, yes.
Yeah, it was my understanding that Jefferson brought Antrim over as a plasterer who acquired land with the Brown. Sorry. That's a lot better. I'm gonna pass to Phyllis.
Thanks, Joe. So, hi, Phyllis Ripper, live at Brightberry. But I just wanted to let everybody know that Aunt Shelton is here tonight. She hasn't said anything, she's right here. And her father was born at Brightberry. She's a Brown descendant. And I just wanted everybody to know she's here.
Thank you so much for
And
coming.
if you've never interviewed her, you should, because she knows so much about Browns Cove.
I think that, first off, that would be amazing. I think that the number one thing that has been fascinating with doing this project is the amount of stories people have about Browns Cove. It's just, it can be overwhelming. I remember every time I meet someone who has some information, they'll go, have you talked to XYZ? And me, after thinking I have all the 20 names down, no, I don't know that person, I'm so sorry. So again, there's a lot more to be done, but hopefully this is a good starting phase kind of move on from there. Not only to do this with just Browns Cove, but hopefully the Historical Society can continue to do this with other properties in Albemarle County, to kind of uncover the history and make it publicly and digitally accessible. I think that's hopefully a worthwhile mission.
The Browns also made furniture. I'm sure most of it was made by their slaves. But my brother Richard is here tonight too, and we have quite a bit of that furniture. I have a secretary from 1795.
Wow.
And we have some tables from 1815 and some beds. And he has a huge amount of the furniture also, and the large sideboard, beautiful sideboard.
That's amazing.
Yes.
It's woodworking seems to have been a core feature of Browns Cove. I mean, there's also after this is not as unfortunately nice as furniture, but in that aftermath of the Civil War headquarters, one of the main things that they were doing was actually creating prosthetic limbs for soldiers.
Yes, they did. Yes, at headquarters, that was where they had. I've seen one of those prosthetic limbs that they made from so many of the Confederates. They had lost their legs and had their legs amputated.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, again, I can't speak for moving forward with the Historical Society or anything along those lines, but there's, again, just goes to show that this is so much, that the stability and connections between now, the present, and the past are still incredibly strong, and merit further investigation and understanding.
I was going to ask, but I believe the two ladies just answered my question that I was going to ask, so I will ask anyway. My question was, were you able to track down some descendants of the Browns family and or people who work for them and conduct some semi-structured interviews for oral history, and that will bring the daily life to life in this? Or are they already included?
So we do not have oral histories at this juncture, which would be the kind of, I think, the next step of the project is talking about folks who can kind of provide us with a lot of that research. Well, our main source base going into this was genealogical data coupled with the Jump Family Collection papers, so the Brown family papers, along with newspaper records, to kind of piece together, and then of course state records like the Virginia Slave Birth Index, et cetera, to kind of piece together what we could. But oral histories was something that I was hoping we would get to, and then it got to be 9 months into the project, and I was like, we need to get this thing done. So I'm hopeful that there could be more work on that front in the future.
Thank you, Jake. That was terrific. A lot of work. I have an overarching question. You talked about three large points of focus. You talked about the scale of Browns Cove, the stability, the long-term stability, and the dynamism. And I just wanted to ask, can you hypothesize as to what was responsible, or what were the factors that really led to that long-term stability? Because that does seem to me to be a particularly unique feature of this area, along with the other two things.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's three main features that contribute to the stability. First and foremost is the geography, the topology of kind of the area. The fact that it is not kind of like the Tidewater region where you're going to have a lot of these tobacco plantations that are focused solely on one product because that's what the soil allows. The areas around Browns Cove are, a lot of times more suited to grazing or more suited to kind of subsistence farming than they necessarily were for large-scale tobacco production. So that's one feature. The second feature has to do with the Brown family themselves and their decisions. The fact that it was divvied up amongst the various kind of sons, and that they all kind of stayed in the area, not sons, but daughters that stayed in the area, collaborating with one another, kind of make this resilient community on one side, certainly help survive. But I think the most significant feature, to be honest, is also the resiliency of the enslaved. The fact that they were focused on survival amidst the harshest conditions, and committed to staying and surviving with one another. And they're the ones that kind of built up Browns Cove, that actually did the labor. And so I think to those three things together kind of contribute to this resiliency in the region. The reason that there is so much kind of long-lasting history from, again, the 18th century to the 20th century. I'll just say this, I've looked at a lot of plantation records in the 19th century of, Alabama, Mississippi, etc. I've never heard of areas like this staying within a family for normally not past the Revolutionary War, but rarely, of course, past the Civil War. The fact that there was that longevity, it's from several different factors, from different areas, from different viewpoints. But I think those are kind of the three main reasons for why there is such stability that you don't see, not only elsewhere in Albemarle County, but really elsewhere in the United States in a lot of cases.
You indicated that the land grant was affected 1740, 45 somewhat. Was the land empty then, or were there still Native Americans around? Was there a struggle with them? In Massachusetts, we know of the Indian Wars, of very active resistance by the Native Americans. Did any of that happen in Virginia?
So, yes, earlier, absolutely. The Powhatan Wars earlier on, English settlers have been warring with Monacan, or Powhatans and then Monacan peoples for, centuries by the time the Browns arrived. There are indigenous people still in the area who are probably, at the time that we have records of, the Browns encountering Native peoples, it's probably the Iroquois, but it could also be the Monacans. We're not for sure because it's from the perspective of someone describing them just as quote-unquote Indians, so we don't exactly know. But there is kind of a treaty in 1722 that basically establishes the land east of the Blue Ridge Mountains as kind of quote-unquote fair game for English settlement. And so there isn't, a conflict necessarily with, there are skirmishes happening at the edges of Brown's Cove by the time that Benjamin Brown Sr. and his family arrives. In fact, at that point, this is kind of post Governor Spotswood's expedition to the Blue Ridge Mountains. So at this point, most indigenous peoples have been pushed westward over the Blue Ridge Mountains by the time the Browns arrive. It is likely that many still lived in the area, but there wasn't a lot of kind of like, let's say, violent tension between, at least in Brown's Cove, between the Browns and indigenous peoples, at least not that we found.
We can take a couple more questions, I think. I see a couple hands, so we'll do a few more questions, and then we also will have time for anyone to come and chat afterward.
Very interesting presentation. I'm interested in Doyle's River. How it got its name and its importance to the development of Brown's Cove.
Y'all are asking some excellent questions. So Doyle's River, off the cuff, I actually don't know regarding the significance of the Doyle, or the naming, the origins of the Doyle's River name. I'm sure someone in this room probably does. But I will say it's significant, it's important because first and foremost, it's a clean water source that's easily accessible. A lot of these sites and plantations need to have readily available water sources that are convenient. For instance, Monticello had a water source, but it didn't actually have one right on the mountaintop where Jefferson was, and so people had to ferry up water every day. For the most part, a lot of the areas in Browns Cove seem to be right situated along the Doyle's River, so there's a ready water access, which was significant for agricultural purposes and also just kind of maintaining the community. There's also, if you go up here, I didn't have a photo, but there's also Doyle's Falls, which is up here to the north, another kind of geographical feature that's kind of unique to the area. And it is significant for providing that kind of support for the agricultural endeavors of the Browns and others, and for allowing these communities to kind of operate and for providing water also for livestock. These are all significant things that the river kind of facilitated. It also is a boundary marker, I would say, for a lot of the property lines that you see early on. It would say up till the Doyle's River, et cetera. Again, boundary and property markers in the early American period are kind of amorphous. It'll be like, to the walnut tree at the end of the Doyle's River. And, that walnut tree won't be here in 150 years, but that's a lot of times how they would describe it. So the river was one way of kind of being a clear boundary marker.
First and foremost, thank you so much for your presentation. My question deals with the enslaved community a little more. So I am just wondering, so you had mentioned that a lot of the consistency was that the enslaved community, a lot of them got to stay together because the Brown family weren't really trading people off there, leasing people out. But a lot of the families, especially in Central Virginia, enslaved families are very connected no matter the plantation, because so many people are being sold back and forth or working for other families. And so I was wondering if you know of any of those situations, or of enslaved families that may have connections to other plantations. And then also if you know if many of the descendants of those enslaved families stayed in that area. You talked a little bit about, there's a head nodding in front of me, but you talked a little bit about like Great Migration, but was that significant for this area?
Yeah, great questions. First and foremost, in terms of talking about the connections between other communities and enslaved people, while we don't have strong records, I think the best evidence we have is the kind of, material cultural evidence of the enslaved cemeteries, which oftentimes will be, this kind of space that was away from kind of the eyes of, brown families, where they can kind of carve out a bit of their own kind of existence and privacy. And again, I think that a lot of times it's very likely those were communal centers, not just for, folks enslaved by the Browns and Browns Cove, but elsewhere as well, the folks who have meeting places. A lot of scholars have talked about, too, the ways in which enslaved people were geographically more mobile than we give them credit for in the 19th century. It wasn't just, fleeing for freedom. A lot of times it would be what we call truancy, fleeing for a period of a few months, a few weeks, is to go see a family member or loved one who's in the area. And that definitely, I'm sure, was happening in Browns Cove, even if those written records aren't as easily accessible. What we do have written records in terms of resiliency is the fact that we see people with the same name who are kind of enslaved, the same age and gender description in like 1840, and the slave census in 1850 are present in 1860. They're also present sometimes on the earlier kind of census records. So we're able to piece together that it seems as though a lot of people aren't being sold off. The populations stay static for the most part. So we don't see that they're growing or reducing at a pretty strong rate, which indicates that very likely there's a little bit more stability than what you would be, very least a little bit, probably a lot more stability in these communities than we would expect. Let's say, that's something I keep bringing up Monticello, but I think it's a great parallel. So, Monticello, you have this hundreds of people basically ripped apart from their families after Jefferson's death. As they're sold off, as the plantation is auctioned off, and everything's auctioned off, and so the lack of an event like that during the antebellum period is pretty critical, I think, in a lot of ways. In terms of the post-emancipation research, we've not done, I think, as much as could be done in the future, that there's a lot more threads we could follow. We do have records that we talked about in the enslavement at Browns Cove section, where we talk about those connections between post-emancipation and the antebellum period. Well, we do have records where we have secondhand evidence and other evidence that during the period of quote-unquote the Great Migration, when there are economic opportunities in northern cities and elsewhere, both because of World War I and just because of the industrialization, we do seem to have a lot of supporting evidence that there seems to be really some supporting evidence that formerly enslaved people did leave Browns Cove in that time. Many of, not formerly enslaved, excuse me, descendants did leave Browns Cove. At least in some numbers. In terms of how many and exactly where they went, I know that there are folks working on that with home place collection and other folks, and we're kind of like delving into this research. And again, there's more to talk about this, more to uncover. But our research, I think, what I think we've done the most on is uncovering the early 19th century antebellum period by going through the Virginia Slave Birth Index, the Chancery orders and Chancery records. And then the slave schedules. These are basically censuses that they did in 1850 and 1860 of enslaved people across the United States. So we kind of pieced together connections where we could. So.
I want to get us to where there are lovely beverages and sweets, while there will still be plenty of time for you to ask your questions of Dr. Calhoun. So if we could, just a quick hand, thank you for this presentation. So before we just conclude here, I want to pass the microphone over to Luke Rourke, who's just going to say a few words and welcome us for some refreshments.